Oh, she's in. Greetings, friends. Good evening, good afternoon, good day, whatever time it is for you. Are you able to hear me? Just do a little wave if you can hear me. Great. Welcome to this really important conversation to be sparked by our lecture presentation on the Jamaican Maroons in Nova Scotia. This year, on August 1st, the Canadian government will be unveiling a plaque to the Maroons. But what led up to that? Keep on with us and you'll hear more. I want to especially acknowledge Dr. Afua Cooper, who will be presenting the lecture, Reverend Dr. Rhonda Britton from New Horizons Baptist Church, who will be leading us in prayer and reflection, Mrs. Olive Phillips, the president of the Jamaican Cultural Association for Nova Scotia, Mr. Russell Gross, the director of the Black Cultural Center of Nova Scotia, and I'm Marjorie Lewis, chaplain at Acadia University and a member of the board of of Jamaican Cultural Association for Nova Scotia. Welcome to all of you who have joined us virtually. We look forward to receiving your questions and comments in the chat after the lecture. And so we move right along and ask Reverend Rhonda to lead us in prayer.
As I pray in my Christian tradition, I invite those who follow other traditions to meditate silently along according to their own faith. Let us pray. Gracious God, as we approach the celebrations of Emancipation Day, we are grateful that over the millennia of human history, you have brought and kept peoples of color through every challenge and every trial we have had to endure. When we consider the subjugation and exile of the Jamaican Maroons here in this place, we are grateful for their strength and resilience. We are grateful, God, that we can embrace our history with pride, understanding that we are descended from sisters and brothers who fought for freedom and justice, and to be self-determining people in whatever land we found ourselves. Thank you for never forsaking us and for raising in each new generation visionaries and leaders who continue to propel us forward. We ask your blessing on this gathering and all the programs planned to commemorate the emancipation of our people. Open our minds and help us to hear with new ears. Please remain with us, inspire us, strengthen and keep us. Give us wisdom and give us courage for the challenges of the present day. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
So over to you.
Well, good evening, everyone. So glad to be here with you to join you virtually this evening for this important lecture by Dr. Afua Cooper on the Jamaican Maroon connection to Nova Scotia. We're so glad to be able to host this event. I'd like to start off with a brief land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that this event is happening in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are privileged and thankful to be holding this event today on land that is covered by historic treaties of peace and friendship. We also acknowledge that people of African descent have called Nova Scotia home for well over 400 years. We take a moment to pause and honor and offer gratitude to those ancestors, such as the Jamaican Maroons, that graced our shores here in Nova Scotia. And we make a commitment to ensure that their history and their legacy is not lost. Thank you.
Well, friends, it's time for the main event, and it's with pleasure that I introduce our lecturer, Dr. Afua Cooper. Dr. Afua Cooper is a historian of Black Canada and the African diaspora. Oh, sorry. This is not my time of day, so I think I've skipped out two very important things. Please forgive me. I'm just a little anxious to get the lecture going. So before that, we need to hear something from the leaders of the two organizations that collaborated to bring this lecture. Mrs. Olive Phillips, the president of the Jamaican Cultural Association for Nova Scotia, and she will be followed by Mr. Russell Gross, the director of the Black Cultural Center. And I'm just so happy for the collaboration between these two organizations as we try to work together as people of African descent. So over to you, Olive. Olive, you're muted. You're muted, my sister. Only if you're muted, we can't hear you. You're as anxious as me to get going, right?
Yeah.
We can hear you now.
Now? Can you? You hear me? Okay. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Jamaican Cultural Association of Nova Scotia, JCANS, we welcome everyone who has joined us tonight virtually to learn more about the interesting historical connection between Nova Scotia and the Jamaican Maroons. We owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Afua Cooper for being willing to share her abundant knowledge with us tonight on this topic. We're very pleased to be collaborating with the Black Cultural Center of Nova Scotia, BCCNS, on this topic of mutual historical interest to us. It is especially significant at this time when we will be celebrating Jamaica's 62 years of independence, the recognition of the significance of Emancipation Day in Nova Scotia, the designation by the Canadian federal government given to the historical significance of the Jamaican Maroons in Nova Scotia, and the mounting of a plaque in their honor at Citadel Hill on August 1st. As many persons may be aware, there is a historical connection between Nova Scotia and Jamaican Maroons dating back to 1796 when they were sent to Nova Scotia from Jamaica. We at JCANS are very happy to have this opportunity to help in educating the public about this topic. JCANS was incorporated in 2013 as a cultural association in Nova Scotia to create a friendly and welcoming environment in which to promote and preserve our cultural heritage and to promote and preserve our island culture, and in Nova Scotia particularly. Since that time, our membership has grown to include not only Jamaicans, but members of all Caribbean islands, as well as Nova Scotians, and any other nationality who is desirous of joining us. The main goals of JCANS have been to create awareness and to educate the public about our historical and cultural roots and to build a positive identity in our youth, letting them know that they too can overcome any obstacle in life and thrive. Looking back over the historical past, we now view the Maroons as positive icons who have overcome great odds and survived. Their indomitable spirit and resilience are inspiring to us today. And so Dr. Afua Cooper will now share her knowledge with you and enlighten us all about it. Dr. Cooper, over to you. Or should I say over to
Before Dr. Cooper, we're having our other partner, Russell, who will give us some more details about August 1st.
I think everyone is so excited here tonight to hear the wonderful Dr. Cooper share some history and insight on the Jamaican Maroons. That we are jumping ahead a bit in the program, but so glad to once again be here and to join you virtually. And it's such a powerful partnership that the Black Cultural Center is pleased to have with the Jamaican Cultural Association. And, it's wonderful that the association has an annual event that is happening this weekend that celebrates the connection between Jamaica and, of course, our communities here in Nova Scotia, and that warming spirit of perseverance that we've carried on, and the legacy continues today for the Jamaican Maroon culture in our country. Also, I'm glad to share that this year on August the 1st, Emancipation Day, I'm going to do a quick screen share here to show you some of the events that are happening here in Nova Scotia to commemorate Emancipation Day. Some of those events include a series of events that will happen on August the 1st. The first event that's going to take place at 10 a.m. at the Halifax Citadel National Historic Site is going to be a commemoration of Emancipation Day, but most importantly, a plaque unveiling by the National Canadian Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Parks Canada as they commemorate the Jamaican Maroons as a subject of national historic significance. Unfortunately, that event, the registration is full for that event. It's at capacity because of the popularity of the event, but you can watch it live online at www.bccns.tv or on the Eastlink cable, community cable television network across Canada. Then later on that afternoon at 1:30 p.m., we have a special exhibit that's being launched at the Canadian Museum of Immigration, Pier 21, that was curated by Dr. Afua Cooper, and it is a national exhibit on slavery in Canada. It's something that you definitely want to see and don't want to miss. And that event has plenty of space available on registration, and you can definitely drop over and join us for that event. Then towards the end of the day, the Black Cultural Center will host a roundtable discussion on Emancipation Day, hosted by Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard and other senators from across Canada, as they delve into the importance of Emancipation Day and the many discussions associated with the betterment of people of color in our country. So lots to look forward to on Emancipation Day. And like I said, all of the events will be live streamed. So if you can't make it there in person, you can join it in live stream. And we're just so fortunate that these series of events will take place to commemorate an important part of our history and our culture. And of course, to celebrate the connection of the Jamaican Maroons and their time in Nova Scotia and their journey from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone and the legacy that lives on. So without further ado, now I'll turn it back over to Reverend Dr. Marjorie to introduce our guest presenter this evening that we're all waiting and anxious to hear a wonderful presentation from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olive and Russell. And Dr. Cooper gave me a lovely short biography, which exemplifies brevity is the soul of wit, except for the lecture. We want the lecture full subject. But let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Afua Cooper. She's a historian of Black Canada and the African diaspora. A former Killam Research Chair, Afua Cooper was recognized by Maclean's magazine in 2022 as one of the 50 most influential Canadians for her work in founding the Black Studies program at Dalhousie University. Dr. Cooper holds the prestigious Royal Society of Canada J.B. Tyrrell's Historical Medal. A founder of the Canadian dub poetry movement, she was Poet Laureate of Halifax for the 2018 to 2020 term. There is lots more that could be said, but let's go over to Dr. Cooper as she helps us to think of our ancestors, to emulate their virtues and to avoid their mistakes. Over to you.
Russell is gonna play the video, Marjorie.
I was able to speak, but there was something asking you to.
I'm just going to ask everybody to kindly mute. We are hearing a conversation in the background. Thank you.
I am Captain Leonard Parkinson. I led my people, the Trelawny Town Maroons, here to Nova Scotia in 1796. You see this fort? This is the fourth fort built here on Citadel Hill. My people built the third. They called it Maroon Bastion. Yes, we were militant and spirited, but wouldn't you be too if you had to fight for your freedom? How else does one free themselves from the shackles of slavery? We have a long and proud history. When the English captured Jamaica in 1655 from the Spanish, the enslaved Africans fled up into the hills and mountains of Jamaica. This is when we got the name Maroon. This word maroon comes from a Spanish word, which means runaway and wild. But to us it meant free, because we were no longer slaves. We built our own communities, but the British would not let us be. In 1795, a British governor took power in Jamaica. He began to mistreat my people, so we revolted and another war broke out. We fought them for a whole year. And then, finally, we had to lay down our weapons and sign a peace treaty. on the condition that we would not be deported from our beloved Jamaica. But the British betrayed this treaty a few months later, and in 1796, they sent us to Nova Scotia, Halifax. We left Port Royal Harbor, Jamaica on June 21st and arrived in Halifax, Nova Scotia on July 21st. 556 men, women, and children. We settled mainly in Preston, but we also stayed in Spryfield and Sackville. As soon as we arrived to this new colony, the government put us right to work. You see, the English and the French were at war, and the government here was afraid that France would attack Halifax. So they formed us into our own militia unit to help the defense of the city. We also helped build buildings on Citadel Hill and help erect the government house. We cleared woods and built roads and highways for Halifax and Dartmouth, and our women and children gathered fruits and berries and even grew vegetables for sale at the Halifax market. But our people were not happy here. It was cold. Cold in Halifax. We couldn't grow as much crops on this difficult soil as we could in Jamaica. Our people wanted to leave, to return to Jamaica or someplace warmer, but neither the British nor the Jamaican government would grant us that wish. But we kept pressing them and pressing them, and finally the British government decided to send us to Freetown, Sierra Leone, Africa, the homeland of our ancestors. Although most of us left in 1800. If you hear the family name, Colley, from East Preston, know that they are the descendants of the Maroons. We are part of the Halifax community now. Come, sit with our ancestors on Citadel Hill.
Hi. Thank you everyone for coming out. I'm assuming that people can hear me. If you can hear me, shout. Okay, so that's very good. Thanks to Jacobs and to the Black Cultural Center and to all of you who are in our audience. It is my pleasure to give this talk. I am going to share, I do have a screen, and I'm going to share my screen. Share, it says, and we're right there. So I wanted to look at the Maroons in three settings. They came to Nova Scotia, as we've been told, since the panel, we opened up. They came from Jamaica. They were deported from Jamaica, came to Canada, i.e. Nova Scotia, and then to Sierra Leone. So here they are in three settings, which speaks to their transatlantic identities, what I call their transatlantic identities, and what I also call overlapping diasporas. No doubt, there were people in the Trelawney Town Maroons collective who were born in Africa and who were taken to Jamaica as enslaved people, and then who ran away and joined the Maroons. The Maroons were free people. And then you have them now deported from Jamaica to Nova Scotia and back to Africa, Sierra Leone, the continent of their ancestors. And it's also interesting to note that when slavery ended in the British Empire in about 1834, 1838, many of the Maroon communities in Freetown, Sierra Leone petitioned to go back to Jamaica. And about 200 of them left Sierra Leone between 1838 and 1841 and returned to Jamaica. And some of them actually came back to Sierra Leone in the 1840s and 50s. So here are people traveling back and forth across the Atlantic in search of freedom. They were really in search of freedom. They were really in search of a place where, as one, I'm going to quote from a Black loyalist who went to Sierra Leone, he said, "We want a place where our children can be free and happy." So I want you guys to keep this in mind, the sense of multiple identities and the sense of overlapping diasporas. I have here a map of the Middle Passage, well, it's more like the triangular trade. The Middle Passage basically is the Atlantic Ocean, and it connects these various continents, at least four continents here, where enslaved people or captives are taken from Africa to the Americas, including Nova Scotia. From the Americas, goods are put on board those ships once the captives have disembarked, and they're sold to be work on plantations where they grow coffee, are involved in cotton cultivation, rice cultivation, sugar cultivation, mining, pearl diving, diamond, you name it. And these goods are put on board the ship and then sent to Europe. From Europe, once these goods are disembarked, then the ships are loaded with items like guns and other manufactured items and sail down the coast to Africa, where these manufactured items are exchanged for human beings, and the process repeats itself. So it's called the triangular trade, but there are many. Sometimes it's not a proper triangle, because you have ships coming down from North America, from the maritime provinces, from New England, straight down to the Caribbean, where they buy the rum, the sugar, etc., and bring it up to North America. And they will take down to the Caribbean dried fish, salted beef, salted pork. So it is through these circuits, I call them circuits of oppression, in which the Maroon collectivity emerged. Now, in the video that was shown, Nathan Simmons, our actor, he said, the word Maroons, it comes from the Spanish word cimarron. It means wild, untamed, runaway. And it's important for us to keep the Spanish origin in mind, because Jamaica, at first, from about 1504, 1503, when Christopher Columbus set up basically a government on the island. He set up a government, then he left, went back to Spain. But from about 1503 to 1655, Jamaica was under Spanish rule. And it's within the context of Spanish rule that we have Maroon communities emerge. The first Maroons, obviously, were Spanish speaking, because they would run away from their Spanish enslavers. The conquest of Jamaica occurred in 1655. The English, the Spanish, when they felt that they were not able to defeat the English, they liberated many of their enslaved Africans and said, go to the woods, go to the hills, and fight the English. Be a thorn in the side of the English. And when the English are weak, we will come back to Jamaica, we will come back from Cuba and take over the island. But that didn't really happen. They weren't able to recoup the island, and you had many settlements of Maroons. Some people may know of the name Juan de Bolas. Juan de Bolas was a Maroon chief, a Spanish Maroon, who reigned in this part of the country, the southern part, called Clarendon. And so there was a Spanish community there. In St. Catharines, you have Los Bermajales. So there were Spanish-speaking Maroon communities all over the island. And they did become a thorn in the side of the English. Eventually, several of these communities did make peace with the English. So, for example, Juan de Bolas, he made peace with the English. The Southern Maroons, Spanish Maroons, they made peace with the English, but it was not everybody. So most people who had established themselves as free people in various communities guarded their freedom and were not going to make any peace with the English. And, what does that mean when you make peace with the English? So for about 80 years, from about 1655 to 1733, Jamaica existed in a state of war. For about 80 years in a state of war. The Maroon communities that eventually, under the English rule, that eventually, and we'll get to that, were kind of a diminution of the original Maroon communities. There was a saying in Jamaica that the Maroons rule Jamaica by night and the British by day. Now there are about 5 Maroon communities in Jamaica, but there was a time in the aftermath of the Spanish defeat when Jamaica was a Maroon country, really was a Maroon country. But after 80 years of warfare by the British, many of these communities contracted, many people were captured, and so on. So when we get to the first Maroon War in 1733, by then we have, I'm just going to call them English communities of Trelawney Town, which was first called Kodja Town. Then you had the towns in Portland there, Nanny Town, Moortown. And if you go back to the west of the island in St. Elizabeth, you see a little triangle, a compound town in the Cockpit country. After the first Maroon War, when they signed the treaty in 1739, you had a town called Charlestown that developed. And it was developed by Nani's war captain. We'll get to Nani, a man by the name of Kwao. He was also nicknamed the Invisible Hunter. So Kwao established another settlement, which is not on the map, in the parish of St. Portland. There it is, that little triangle at the top, called Charlestown. So that's just a quick history of the origins of the Maroons, how they, there was a Spanish dispensation and then a English and British colonial dispensation. And I'm saying that from 1655 with the conquest of Jamaica to 1733 when the first Maroon War broke out, Jamaica really existed in a state of war. I should also point out that we are not talking about Jamaican citizens or the people having equal rights. We're talking about a slave society. The majority of the Black people were enslaved, whether they were under Spanish rule or English rule or British rule. There's a little difference between the English and British rule. We can talk about that later. But these were slave societies. And the place they conceived of that Black people should have was that of enslavement. That was the role. Their role was to be slaves to produce the whatever, sugar, this and that, for the wealth of Britain or for the wealth of Spain, and in other islands for the wealth of whichever imperial power. So that was the role. So not only was it a colonial war that the Maroon engaged in, they also engaged in a race war. It was also a race war, because the people were dominating them or attempting to dominate them were white people. I should also say that there were other Maroon communities all over the Caribbean and South America. The first Maroon communities existed in Haiti and Dominican Republic. There were Maroon communities in Mexico. They're called Palenques. In Brazil, all over, even in the United States, in the Great Dismal Swamps, in places like Florida and Virginia, there were Maroon communities. If you think of the word Maroon meaning runaway, wild. So right now in Suriname, they are very vibrant, independent Maroon communities. And one of the things that the Surinamese Maroons were able to do that the Jamaican Maroons have not yet been able to do is that the Surinamese Maroons have representative, I think they have 3 representatives in the Suriname Parliament, which shows you the kind of power. And Suriname was colonized by the Dutch. Now, the Maroon culture, whether it's under Spanish rule or English rule, for some reason, was dominated by the Akan culture. Now, Akan, when we think of Akan, many people think of Ghana, and rightly so. There are like 5 main Akan nations that spread across Ghana, Togo, Ivory Coast, even up to what is now Burkina Faso. And intrinsic to Akan cultures are such that they have in common. There are certain type of marriage practices, religion and ritualistic practices. They have their own form of justice, the naming of children, military techniques, which we'll get into later, medicine and healing, and Akan linguistics. And you find that in the Jamaican Maroon communities, and also in the Maroon communities in Suriname. I said Afrocentric orientation. They were free as much as possible of European cultural intrusions. They had a pro-Black philosophy. You wouldn't find Maroon people then bleaching their skin. They did not despise their Blackness and their culture. They were empowered people. The Akan system of gender obtained here in these communities. Women were held in high esteem, mirroring the African Akan system, which was a matrilineal system. The Maroon communities had a tradition of women leaders based on the queen mothers of the Akan societies in places like Ghana and Togo and Ivory Coast. Many of these queen mothers, they were skilled midwives. They knew herbal medicine. And think about it. You had to have midwives in these communities that existed in the mountains, in inaccessible places, in forests, in swamps, in jungles. They couldn't just say, hey, the lady's giving birth, we're going to go down to the Savlamar Hospital. No, they had to deliver that baby themselves. So they knew the land, they knew the flora, they knew the fauna. The men and boys were trained to be warriors par excellence. That's one of the reasons when the Maroon people, the men landed in Halifax, they pressed them right away into militias because they were impressed with their military skills. In times of great emergency, of great stress, women and girls were also trained in warfare methods. But that was not the usual thing. In the first war, the first Maroon War, which took place from about 1733 to 1739, give or take, Queen Nanny of the Eastern Maroons in the parish of Portland, removed the women and girls to towns that were called Girls' Town or Women's Town. So they were taken away because the leaders didn't want them to be captured. So the men were sent fighting because the women, I think the idea was, we'll be able to reproduce society. These communities were really living under stress. And I've said here, they were surrounded by hostile, racist, and slave-based colonial society. And the British had the goal to re-enslave the Maroons and appropriate their lands. Now, this is a famous painting. It's called Trelawney Town, the chief residence of the Maroons. And Trelawney Town was the settlement from which the people who were deported to Nova Scotia came. Trelawney Town is or was not in the parish of Trelawney. Jamaica has 14 parishes. One of them is called Trelawney. And that parish was named after a colonial governor by the name of Governor Trelawney. And perhaps the town was named after Trelawney too. But this Trelawney town was actually in the parish of St. James, in the Cockpit country, but close enough to the parish of Trelawney and also to the parish of St. Elizabeth. Now, if you look closely at this painting, it's not just an idyllic, bucolic scene that we see these neat cottages, the verdant landscape, the beautiful mountains. But if you look closer, you will see white men on horseback. One is holding a sword, another one is holding a gun, and you see People, Black people with guns, with rifles, running, shooting, whatever. This is warfare. And this was painted by one of the military painters that traveled with the British military. Some of the most iconic paintings we have of Halifax was painted by military artists who traveled with the British military, wherever that military went. The same thing here. It says Trelawney Town, the chief residence of the Maroons. The painting gives you an idea that we are in a high elevation. We're in a high elevation. Now, Trelawney Town previously was called Koja Town. Koja is the name of one of the leaders from the First War. Tradition has it that he's a brother to Nani, that Koja Nani Akompong and another man, leader by the name of Njoni, were siblings. But previously, this town was called Koja Town, and it was said that the first treaty, the first peace treaty of 1739 in the Cockpit country, this is for this area, was signed here in Koja Town, which was renamed Trelawney Town. When the Maroons were deported to Nova Scotia, it was renamed Maroon Town. And now the area has a new name. It's called Flagstaff. But there's also a Maroon Town, a place called Maroon Town close by in the Cockpit country of Western Jamaica. So this is when you hear Captain Leonard Parkinson and others saying, we want to go back home. You can see how lush the place was. There are cattle in the foreground here. The place is green, it's beautiful. And this was the land that was stolen from them. So I keep talking about the first war, the first Maroon War, as a culmination of 80 years of struggle and tension between the Jamaican colonial government and the Maroon society. And the war resulted in several peace treaties signed with the Maroon communities across the island. Those in the cockpit really means Western Jamaica. And the cockpit is this kind of rugged countryside, limestone rocks, so very, up and down. And then the Eastern Maroons where we have the Blue Mountains, the tallest mountains in Jamaica, signed by Nani and her war captain, Kwao, in the East and in the West. These treaties were signed. And it's interesting because when you look at the first treaty that was signed after like 5 years of warfare, it actually showed the weakness of the Maroon community or communities. I won't go into that too much, but there's a contentious clause in the treaty that they agreed to. And that clause said they would hunt runaway slaves, and that any runaway slave that came to join the Maroon communities, they would return them back to the slave master or to the authorities. They signed that treaty, or they signed that clause. The Maroons in Suriname, when the Dutch presented them with that clause, they said, no, we're not going to sign that clause. We're not going to return our brothers and sisters to you. The Maroon in Jamaica agreed to that clause because they had gotten weak by nearly 10 years of warfare. And the British really did not know how drained the Maroon was. So they also signed a clause, agreed to a clause in that treaty, in the 1739 treaty, that said that they would build roads on behalf of the British. They would make highways and pathways and avenues and build roads through the mountains. Very, very contentious. But they did receive official recognitions and titles to the land and territories that they inhabited. So they became subjects of the crown and the land that they received. So when Maroons are having problems with the Jamaican government, they say, we didn't sign any treaty with you. We signed a treaty with the British crown. We have similar discourse here in Nova Scotia. It is the crown that we appeal to, not you. But in signing those treaties, they became subjects of the crown. Now, I talk about Nani of the Maroons. It was in the context of the first Maroon War that Nani arose. She was a chief She was a leader, she was a queen, she was a midwife, and she was a ritual specialist. What do I mean by that? Ritual specialist. Some people, she was an Obia woman. She knew how to control the elements. They said when the Maroons were starving in eastern Jamaica, she grew pumpkin in 3 days. Take that. There's a saying in Jamaica, some may get it, some may sell it. It's part of the Maroon lore that Nanny went up to a place called Pumpkin Hill and she grew pumpkin in 3 days when her people were starving. She's one of Jamaica's national hero, greatly. She's loved. Nanny is credited with the camouflage warfare that the Maroon community engaged in. So there's, when you cannot fight conventional warfare that the British were fighting. You load, you shoot, you stay in an open area. No, Maroons engaged in guerrilla warfare. They hit, they run. They knew the mountains. And they said Nanny was the one who said, okay, camouflage yourself with branches of the trees. Green, you're green like the mountains. So someone would shoot and kill a British soldier. When his comrades look around, there'd be no one. All they see was trees standing until the trees began to move because they were covered up by green bush. So Nanny was a military strategist, a leader of her people, and a mother to her people. And she emerged out of the context of the First War. Every Maroon leader, queen, king, whomever, had war captains. And Nanny's war captain was Captain Quawo. As I said, he was known as the invisible hunter. Again, tradition said Quawo could make himself invisible. And Quawo, after the war and the treaty was signed, Quawo left from the higher mountains and came down to a place called Charlestown, where he established his own community. Now, they existed in an uneasy peace with the British. The clause about returning runaways really rubbed them the wrong way. They didn't like it. Sometimes they would accept runaways. Sometimes they would return them. Perhaps it is to the eternal sadness of the Maroons that when we had the Taki War that broke out in Jamaica in 1760, it was some of the Maroon soldiers that tracked Taki and brought him to the colonizers in Spanish Town, and Taki was executed. The Maroons were great trackers. They knew the mountains. If they saw leaf turnover, they knew what it meant. So the tension continued, and it broke out again in 1795 in war between the Trelawney Maroons, not the other Maroon communities, not Scott Hall community, not Moortown, not Charlestown, not a compound. The Second Maroon War was between the Trelawney Maroons and the British Jamaican government. Continued with guerrilla warfare. You had the mighty British Army, by now the most powerful army on the planet, fighting a band of fierce, determined warriors and losing to them. Because the British, they wore these red clothes, they're called uniforms, they're called red coats. The Maroon practiced guerrilla warfare. More British soldiers died in this war than Maroon men who were fighting them. So what the British did, they were the government, they upped the ante by bringing in tracking dogs from Cuba to hunt the Maroons. They also pursued a burnt earth policy. Burnt earth policy really means that you burn everything in sight. It was, the Americans did that in Vietnam, was meant to bring starvation and famine on the people. They had no food. We had it here in Nova Scotia when the British and the French were fighting here. The British also engaged in this burnt earth policy to bring the people to subjugation. So at this point, the British really did not know how weak the Trelawney Maroons were, because they went further and further into the mountains, but they were hungry. But imagine people were hungry, fighting with such great vigor. Now, Walpole, a man by the name of Colonel Walpole, he was the one who was leading British forces. He was the one, his idea to bring the trackers in and the hound dogs in from Cuba, but he had a great respect for the Maroons. So the peace treaty was proposed. Both sides accepted it. I think the Maroons were happy to accept it because they had run out of food and things were not going well for them. But they suspected that Governor Balcarres, the governor of the island, they knew Balcarres hated them, and they knew Balcarres would want to deport them from the island. So they said to Walpole, we will lay down our arms. We will sign the treaty. We don't want to be deported. Walpole said, no, you have my promise. It won't happen. You will not be deported. Lay down your arms. But who can trust the British? Because when they lay down their arms and, Balcarres found some kind of hook to say, you broke the treaty. We're going to deport you. And that was what happened. As you know, over 500 men, women, and children were rounded up, put on ships in Port Royal or Kingston Harbor, and were sent to Nova Scotia. Now, the government of Nova Scotia didn't even know they were coming to Nova Scotia. Wentworth was governor. Why they came to Nova Scotia? These three ships, the Anne, the Dover, and the Mary, were going to Britain from Jamaica. And Balcarres had these Maroons. He wanted to get rid of them. So he put them on the ship and said, look, when they get to Nova Scotia, Wentworth can deal with them. And that was what happened. They came to Nova Scotia. I should also say that there were more women on those ships than men. Why is that? When many families, when many mothers, sisters, wives learned that their sons and their brothers and their husbands were going to be transported off the island, they said, we're going with them. And that speaks to the strength and the closeness of the Maroon communities. They took their children with them. Also, many Maroon men were polygamous. So they had several wives who came from Jamaica with them to Nova Scotia. One of the war captains, in every war situation, you're going to have, of course, you have captains. And one of the famous war captains who came to Nova Scotia that our first Nathan in the skit talked about was Leonard Parkinson. Leonard Parkinson is very interesting, and I hope we're able to do more research on him, because he was one of the captains that fought the British in the mountains, the Cockpit Mountains in Jamaica. He came to Nova Scotia, and he also went to Sierra Leone. You see, he has a gun, he has his musket, and he has his cutlass. So this guy means business. I talked earlier about the red coats. This was kind of like the uniform that the British, foot soldiers, they would wear. Now imagine you're tramping through the bush and the mountains in a red coat. You're easily spotted. You're just kind of making yourself a target for the Maroons who have a bush around them. You can't see them, who practice guerrilla warfare, who were expert shooters. Today, I guess we would call them snipers. So they laid down their arms. They surrendered to Governor Balcarres in the capital of Jamaica, which was Spanish Town at the time. Balcarres tricked and betrayed them. They were deported. That was on the ticket. But not all of the Trelawney Town Maroons came to Nova Scotia. Many fled to other parishes. Others merged with existing Cockpit Country Maroons. And the land of the Trelawney people were then appropriated by the colonial government and the planters, which was what they wanted in the first place. There's a whole backstory to this. Jamaica was eaten up by sugarcane cultivation. The planters, they wanted to take more and more and more land. When they look at the Maroon land, they said, oh, this is beautiful land. We want it. So the planters were the ones who actually egged on Governor Balcarres to deport the Maroons, Trelawney Maroons from Jamaica, because they wanted their land. They wanted their land. If very similar to how the British wanted the land of the Acadians when they deported the Acadians and took their land. Exact thing happening in Jamaica. The Trelawneys were deported and their land appropriated. I've said before that in warfare, the British did not defeat the Maroons at all. Pound for pound, dollar for dollar, as people say, the Maroons were overpowered them. But the British, they had the power, they had the means. They were the colonizers of the island. They could bring in more and more and more and more military if they wanted to. They could send to Canada or wherever to get more soldiers to fight the Maroons. So I put in here the abeng. The abeng was an instrument. You see this man, he's an expert abeng blower. The abeng is made from the cow's horn, the horn, and you can blow, it has holes and you can blow through it and send messages. In West Africa, it could be like the talking drums. The talking drums in West Africa, the rhythm or the beats on the drum mimic the language spoken by the people. So if someone dies, like a chief, the talking drum would send out that message. A great elephant, the great elephant has fallen in the forest. Someone knows somebody of high importance has passed away. The abeng likewise can say, redcoats are climbing the hills. Redcoats are climbing the mountains. There are 400 redcoats, or how many British soldiers. The abeng can tell you, children, 8 babies were born, in August or whatever. Somebody has died. So abeng, before we had a telephone, was the instrument that was used to alert the people as to what is what. So you can stay on one peak of the mountain with your abeng and you blow the abeng, and people over the other side of the mountain, they hear and they said, oh my God, this is what happened. It could be good news, it could be bad news. But this gentleman was an expert abeng player, and he was featured in a film. Once the Maroons arrived in Nova Scotia in July 1796, their Nova Scotia sojourn began. And there's a historian, he was at St. Yves by the name of John Grant. He wrote a book called The Maroons in Nova Scotia. It's available. I urge everyone to read it because he really goes in depth about the time they spent here and their history. Map of Nova Scotia. The Maroons were in Dartmouth, in Peninsula Halifax. They also lived in Chocolate Lake. They also in Spryfield. Eventually, they were many of them were taken to Preston. Then there was a breakaway group, and they went to Sackville, Nova Scotia. But when they came, they first lived in tents on the property of Citadel Hill. So this is a painting of one of the iterations of the Citadel Fortress. And this painting was recently commissioned by the Army Museum of Halifax here, showing the Maroon men, this individual here in uniform, and helping to build the third fortress. Now, Once the Maroons arrived in July and they got off the ship, so some of them died. I can't remember how many people died from Jamaica to Nova Scotia on board the ship, but maybe at least 24 people died, if not more. But once they got here, Governor Wentworth and the Duke of Kent, who was responsible for the British forces in British North America, pressed the Maroon men into service because there was a feeling that the French was going to attack Nova Scotia, and they knew that the Maroons were good fighting men, so they provided uniforms, pressed them into service, they treated them like soldiers and put them to work on the citadel, but also paid them wages, equal wages. They weren't paid less than the white men or soldiers who were working on the fortress. The Maroon men also built roads, highways in both Halifax and Dartmouth. They also worked on what we know now as Queenpool Road. They worked on Octoloni Road or Boulevard over there in Dartmouth. And the women also engaged in horticulture. They made brooms, picked berries, poultry farming, eggs, and sold them in the market. Now, people may be wondering why the deportation? What was happening? We know that Governor Balcarres wanted them off, really off. There was such hysteria going on in Jamaica. And part of this hysteria was inspired, if you will, by the Haitian Revolution. This is 1796, 1795. The Haitian Revolution broke out in 1791 when the enslaved Haitians rose up against their slave masters and engaged in a 13-year war to oust the French from Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, as it was later called. It was an anti-slavery war, it was a race war, it was an anti-colonial war. Haiti was a gem in the French diadem, in the crown. Haiti was the Haitian, one Haitian slave was supporting 8 people in France. 8 white people. That was the kind of wealth that Haiti was producing. Prior to that, the French Revolution had broken out 2 years later, and eventually they beheaded the king and the queen. So imagine Haiti. Imagine these Black people in Haiti rising up, fighting their colonizers, liberating the slaves. The other white colonizers in the Caribbean and the Americas were petrified, and they were upset, and they brought the armies of the world to defeat Haiti. The British, imagine the British and the French are fighting, right? But they were able to join forces to invade Haiti. The Spanish invade Haiti. They even brought mercenaries from Poland to fight against the Black Haitians. Every slave colony in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean was looking to Haiti. Haiti was a beacon of light. So Governor Balcarres actually accused the Trelawney Maroons of consorting with Haitian revolutions to invade Jamaica. It was not true. It was not true at all. But I just want to give you an idea of the hysteria that was pervading the legislature in Jamaica. So the Haitians eventually won their battle against France, won the war against France. But Balcarres, he said, look, having the Trelawney town people in Jamaica is dangerous. We got to get them off. So that was one of the reasons for the deportation, the Haitian Revolution. They felt it was going to spread to Jamaica. The British were also, around the same time, fighting. These people were called the Black Caribs on the island of St. Vincent. The Black Caribs was a community that was formed by enslaved Africans and the indigenous Caribs of the island of St. Vincent. And they, at this time, same time the Second Maroon War was going on, you had the Second Black Carib War of these Carib people against the British. in 1796-97, the British also deported something like 2,000 to 3,000 of these Maroon blacks from St. Vincent to Honduras in Central America, where they became known as the Garifuna. So deporting people was an imperial strategy. Not to mention that years before, in 1755, the British had deported something like 10,000 Acadians from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and stole their land. But coming back to the point that the Haitian Revolution, and this is an image of Toussaint Louverture, the great leader of that revolution, but the Haitian Revolution was one of, for both sides, Governor Balcarres was petrified by it, and he said, we got to get the Trelawneys off the island. Another book, Back to Africa, George Ross and the Maroons from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. Another excellent book on the topic. And Mavis Campbell, a historian of Jamaican origin, wrote this book. And really what she did was to look at George Ross's diary. So very, very excellent work. So then in 1800, after 4 years of petitioning, the Maroons kept petitioning both the imperial government in London, the local government of Nova Scotia, and the Jamaican colonial government. They're like, we want to return to Jamaica, send us back home. Or if you're not sending us back to Jamaica, find us a warm place. And in 1800, again in August, they boarded a ship called the Asia and were taken to Freetown, Sierra Leone. Now, something like 8 years prior, in 1792, 1,200 Black Loyalists had left Nova Scotia for Freetown, Sierra Leone. So, you know, Sierra Leone looms large in the history of Black Canada and Black Nova Scotia. It's an important place, and we need to do more research on this connection. It really is. If you think the Black Loyalists, 1792, 1,200 people, and now 8 years later, the Maroons are also being sent to Sierra Leone on the coast of West Africa. I should say that in Nova Scotia, you read John N. Grant's book, The Maroons in Nova Scotia. When the Maroons got here, the colonial government tried to assimilate them into Eurocentric culture, and they just refused. They wanted them to work as laborers. For white farmers, they refused. They said, hey, we had our farms in Jamaica. If you want us to work as farmers, send us back to Jamaica. We're not going to work for anyone. Especially that the Maroons, they had their money because the colonial government in Jamaica, in order to sweeten the pot for Nova Scotia, gave them $25,000 in British, I guess, currency to look after themselves in Nova Scotia. So when they came, the economy of Nova Scotia actually prospered because they had to buy food, they had to buy jackets, they had to buy shoes. So they were not in a hurry to be working as laborers, as servile workers for anyone. It was fine, you know, for the men to join the militia. That was their métier anyway. That was their profession. Wentworth sent missionaries up to Preston to convert them to Christianity. They said, no, thank you. They repudiated Christianity. Some of the Maroon leaders would actually go to church and argue with the priest. And how do we know that? Because in the diaries of some of these missionaries, they wrote that. They said, you know, so-and-so came to church this Sunday, but he was just interested in having this discussion, because the missionaries would tell some of the men that they cannot have polygamy because polygamy is not Christian. And of course, these men, they knew that some of the Old Testament patriarchs that were beloved by Christian communities everywhere were polygamous. So one of them said to one of the preachers, okay, who do you admire in the Bible? And the preacher would say, oh, we admire Moses, we admire David, we admire Solomon. And the Maroon man would say, well, you know, David had 5 wives, and not to mention Solomon. And they would say, okay, we will put away one of our 3 of our wives, because they had 4 wives, some of them. But it would not be fair. The other wives would not be happy. So tell us which one to keep. So it was, you know, they had their own worldview, their own intellectual worldview, and they knew the Bible because they could argue with the missionaries. The Maroons buried their dead in ways that were reminiscent of African customs. They buried their dead with goods in the grave. And there were other traditions, Jamaican, African traditions that they brought to Nova Scotia. So Wentworth tried so much to assimilate them, did not work. The Maroons relented on one point. They sent their children to school, the schools that the missionaries provided, because they knew that literacy in English was going to be important for the advancement of the community. And they had all the letters and petitions that they were sending to London and sending to Jamaica. They had people in their community who were literate. So these were people who had agency, who had resilience, who were resistant to these strategies and these measures to drown them in Eurocentric culture and to break their spirit. They were very close-knit, and I call them liberation fighters of the 18th century. This is the 18th century in which Britain emerged as a dominant European power in the great contest with France. That was one of the backdrop. And the Maroons, I just think it's brilliant that here you have these people who did not have the material resources that the colonizers had, but they had the audacity and the temerity to face off against these colonizers, literally faced off. When what triggered the Second Maroon War that I didn't go into, when they left Falmouth and Montego Bay and went into the hills and they said, this is it, war, death before dishonor. These are not people who were servile or who were, you know, afraid of their own shadow. These were people who had self-esteem, who had a strong, you know, sense of themselves, that they could take on the British because they saw themselves as equal, not as servile, not as cringing people, but as, you know, people who were strong, and they affirmed themselves. So when they came to Nova Scotia, they said, okay, we were tricked, we were kind of defeated, we're here now, we're still not going to bow to you. I just think it's an incredible story. But to the point, by 1838, in Freetown, Nova Scotia, there's a church, a Methodist church, called the Maroon Church. Interesting, I would say. So here are the people who didn't, you know, repudiated Christianity, but the Eurocentric culture was so strong, which was forced on them, that by 1838, here it is, the church was founded in 1808, but this building was erected around 1838. It's in downtown Freetown, close to the cotton tree. We know about the famous cotton tree. And I took this picture myself. I was in Freetown, Sierra Leone at one point. I visited this church. I went inside. I had a tour of the church. So if you go, and maybe there are people in the audience who have been to the church, the city of Freetown, 19th century, a painting. Freetown, there's the ocean, and then the mountain steeply rises, or the hills, from the sea, from the ocean. So that is where the Maroons would have been taken to. And I have said the Trelawney Maroons and the Maroons as a whole were these fierce fighters, were these people who had a strong sense of themselves. But imagine you're building communities. You have built communities of resistance. You have created leaders. You have created people able to fend for themselves and lived as free, independent people. I think it's just phenomenal. And with that, here are some resources. I think Russell will put up the slideshow. Here's some resources that you can look at. And I thank you for your kind attention. And please, I'll stop there for now, and I will take your questions, which you will write in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sister Afua. Wow. It's quite a bit to digest, but I like the idea of the moving to different places and making a way, keeping the fight for freedom and the resilience. You know, when you put it like that, it is really quite remarkable. This wasn't taking a flight to get, you know, from Jamaica to Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone, and in some cases back to Jamaica again.
Back to Jamaica, yeah.
But it's really fantastic, and the intellectual and theological quality to argue with the clergy about and all of this is really, really interesting. But I also like the question of the unity, the closeness of the families. I didn't realize before you said it that they were paid the same as the white soldiers. At Citadel Hill. So it's really a lot for us to think about, and also how do we cope under pressure, because we're still under the legacies of colonialism, you know. So what do we do? How do we make choices? How do we retain our dignity? How do we collaborate? Anyway, I'm talking and hoping that somebody will put something in the chat, so it's not just my my ideas. But are there any questions or comments that you'd like to put in the chat? In the meantime, I wonder if I'm going to give Rhonda and Russell maybe a little privilege here while we wait on things to come in the chat. What stood out for you? And any questions strike you? Since three of us have Jamaican ancestry, direct Jamaican ancestry, I will give the other two to go first.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you once again, Dr. Cooper, for the wonderful presentation. I think it really speaks to the perseverance of the Jamaican Maroon culture and the impact that it's had, that long-lasting impact that it's had, not only here in Nova Scotia, but in Sierra Leone. You know, I think that speaks volumes to the community. I'm going to actually, you know, we're going pretty late on our time, and so I wanted to make sure that the folks that have questions in the question and answer section can get those questions answered. I'm not sure, Dr. Lewis, Reverend Dr. Lewis, if you can see the question and answer section. But
no, I just got a text that the chat is disabled, so people have not been able to put their questions in the chat. I'm not sure what's going on.
Yes, so it's in the question and answer section. There's a section that's called Q&A. And there's a few questions there, so I'll start reading the questions for now until we can get it so that you can see it on your screen. So
I'm seeing it now.
Okay, great.
Put it up?
I'll turn it over to you. Go ahead.
Okay, so what you want me to do? Share my screen? Well, I'll read this. Since we have a few to give everybody a chance, I will read what is there, and maybe Afua can group the answers. So first of all, many thanks. Somebody wants to know, what did you find most fascinating about your studies? What were some of the last names associated with the Maroons in Jamaica, Nova Scotia, and Sierra Leone? More thanks. An interesting question. How do I find out if I'm a Maroon? So let me start with those.
Okay, so thank you, Marjorie, and thanks to the questioners, if that's a word. What I found most fascinating about the research, and it always is, it's just the if we could go into the heads of the Maroons for a minute, whether they are Eastern Maroon or Western Maroon, doesn't matter. But these people, they were so empowered. They believe themselves to be equal. So I see them as harbingers or embodiment of this, it became very prominent, after the Second World War, this whole idea of human rights and the quest for freedom. These are some of the early advocates of what we call human rights and civil rights, because they believed in equality for everyone, but they also believed they didn't have an inferiority complex. Because one of the impact of slavery on the psyche of Black people is the creation of this inferiority complex. And on the psyche of white people, the creation of a superiority complex. Maroons did not have an inferiority complex. They said, we are great people. Our kids are wonderful. They're beautiful. Look at their complexion. Whatever. We can do this. But to think that they felt that they could take on the British and hold them to a truce every time. It's simply amazing. How do you find out if you're Maroon? That's an interesting question. I'm not sure there's such a thing as Maroon blood. Maybe Margie can speak to that. She being a Maroon, like, if you do your DNA, you said, oh, that's a Maroon DNA. Not necessarily. When I used to go to the conference in Charlestown, they used to say every Jamaican is a Maroon, but the Jamaicans who don't identify as Maroons is because they don't know that they have lost themselves, they have lost their identity. If we can think now of Maroon as a mentality that one has, a mentality of strength. There are so many people who actually, like I said, even before the First War in 1733, we don't have any identifiable Maroon communities in places like Manchester and Clarendon right now. But those islands those parishes were identified as run by the Maroons, especially the Spanish Maroons. But over time, there was, the warfare, and the British were relentless in this warfare. So Maroons always lived in a state of defensiveness. They always had to be defending themselves. So, but so many people are Maroons. As I said, many of the Trelawney Maroons themselves, who were not deported to Nova Scotia, took refuge in other parishes and kind of merged in with the free Black population. On my mother's side, my mother's father's side, his mother, a woman named Janie Stewart, who is my great-grandmother, she was born in Westmoreland, but the story that she has of her ancestors was that they were Trelawney Maroons and they fled to Westmoreland after the big war. So, what I also want to say is this, that we are now in 2024, and this deportation, when the Trelawney Town Maroons were deported and exiled and thrown on the high seas, that was like it was like a dismemberment in the body of the general Maroon collectivity. Think of that. They lost an entire community. Have people healed from that? Have people healed from this dismemberment? This is something I want people to think about. What are some of the last names associated? The Collie, not everybody went to Sierra Leone. Some families remained for whatever reason they remained. The Collie family is one such name. There are many last names. The Campbell, there was a Campbell from Jamaica to Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. That was a last name. Uncle Zizwe, who I think is on this program, he said his mother's family, who were Trelawney Maroons, were Gabidon. They were in Nova Scotia. They went to Sierra Leone. So there's a lot of interest going on now. There are people, there's a historian at the Maroon Church in Freetown who's doing a lot of work on this topic. So the person want to find out if there are Maroons. I would say yes. And if you're Maroon, then you learn as much of the history as you can. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, if I could say something about that. You mentioned the question of checking your DNA and so on, but also stories, because a lot of, certainly for my family, a lot of what we know is the stories that were passed down about the Maroons and about which ones were healers. And you mentioned something about the tussle between a kind of Europeanized Christianity, and I say that because Christianity was in Africa long ago in Orthodox churches, Coptic churches, and things like that, but that's for another story. So I would call that the Europeanized Christian version, and the African identity. So I would say even in terms of the stories coming down in my family, some of it was kept very quiet because the culture saw the healing arts as obvious.
Yeah.
Right? But there is the oral tradition, and it might be interesting. I mean, people can track records, quite a few records in Jamaica, and fairly easily in terms of your ancestors, birth certificates and things like that. You can go a couple of generations back, but also maybe pay attention to the oral tradition. What are the stories that are being passed down? Because there may be some clues in those stories about,
and also
people
started to hide their identities. People started to hide who they were, because there are a time when Maroons were discriminated against in Jamaica. And imagine after the Second War, when these people were deported to Nova Scotia, people were hiding. People running into Westmoreland and St. Elizabeth are not going to say, hey, we just came from Trelawney Town. They're going to blend in as best as they could, and they're going to keep quiet because the colonial forces are against them. So
another form of camouflage?
Another form of camouflage, but then they talk, they tell their children and their grandchildren and what have you. And so that is how they when I was coming up, and they say, oh, Jenny Stewart was a Maroon, Jenny Stewart was a Maroon. Our family walked from Trelawney Town to Westmoreland. That was just something that we heard as growing up. Someone said here that there were Maroons not only in the Caribbean. Yeah, and I did say that there are Maroons in Central America, Latin America, Ecuador, Bolivia, and there's a room dedicated to the Maroons in Panama. So it's a vibrant history.
I would say if people are interested in that, they may want to look at the Charlestown Conference. Every year in June, there is a conference in Charlestown, and very often Maroons and Indigenous people from across the Caribbean and Central America, North America, and scholars from many places converge on Charlestown. I'm not sure what the state of the newsletter, but they had a magazine that was carrying articles on Maroons and Indigenous people. I didn't check if it's still going, but that's an interesting space where the solidarity and the interconnectedness, because you mentioned like the Garifunas and so forth, that interconnectedness between the indigenous and those early Maroons, that's a solidarity that is still alive in many places in the Americas. And that Charlestown conference is where a lot of not just scholarly papers, but sharing of cultural traditions happens once a year.
Yeah, absolutely. And that conference happens, no.
I think it's in June in Charlestown.
Yeah, June and July, June or July.
Mhm.
Sometimes the date varies. Someone
Yes.
said, you mentioned that the Maroons were employed as soldiers who were paid the same as white soldiers. They were paid the same on Citadel Hill. Yeah. Unlike the Black loyalists who were cheated of their wages and who were not paid the same as white laborers in road work, we have so many examples of that. The Maroons were paid. That's one of the other things. The Maroons were conceived of in a different way than the previous Black collectives who came. Governor Wentworth, who was governor at the time of the arrival of the Maroons, admired them. The Duke of Kent, who was Queen Victoria's grandfather, admired them. They said, hey, they're great fighting men, which is interesting because many of the Black loyalist men were also fighting men. They just came out of a war in which they were in a militia. But the Maroons, sort of came as these independent people. And I think the fact that the Jamaican Assembly also sent money with them because they traveled with two commissioners. Ochterlony Street over in Dartmouth is named after one of the commissioners who traveled with the Maroons. And these were white men from Jamaica. But the fact that they came sort of with their own money, they felt so wronged that Balcarres rounded them up, had soldiers stationed, and deported them off the island. And, they kept up a petition writing. Walpole, who had led the British forces against them in Jamaica, had now went back to England and entered the British Parliament as a member of Parliament. So they contacted Walpole, and Walpole was very incensed that they were deported because from soldier to soldier, he gave them his word that they would not be deported. So when the Jamaican Assembly said they're gonna deport the Maroons, Walpole resigned. In fact, they gave Walpole a purse with many gold pieces, and they gave him a sword for his work against the Maroon, and Walpole refused to take it. So he was a soldier of honor. He said, I gave the Maroons my word, they would not be deported. You want to deport them here. Take back your gold, take back your sword. I don't want it. So Walpole went to London and became a friend of the Maroon, and in fact began advocating for them in the Imperial Parliament when they said, they want to move, so on and so forth. So the Maroons were seen in a different light than the Black loyalists and even the refugees of the War of 1812 who came later. So the fact that, they were paid equal wages, they were accorded a kind of respect because of their background. They were a nation, they were a free nation, albeit a nation in the middle of a slave society, but they were a nation. And the powers that be at the time in Nova Scotia accorded them that respect.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I seem to recall reading somewhere, I can't remember if it was Kofi Agorsa's work, that the guerrilla strategy, warfare strategy of the Maroons was of particular interest to the British, and that some work was done to record that in terms of the British war writings and strategies that the British might want to use in some other point. But it was so long ago, I can't remember. Does that ring a bell for you that whole all of this camouflage and the guerrilla warfare that they were interested, that they were able to beat the redcoats. And I gather that some work was done to record, once the treaties were signed, to record the strategies and to include in their historical documents.
Yes, well, if you look at even the painting that we have there of Maroon Town or Trelawney Town was reproduced in Bryant Edwards' book. Bryant Edwards was a notorious planter, Jamaican planter, and just a Afrophobe, a hater of Black people. But he was also a historian. He was a historian of Jamaica. And he records that painting is reproduced in one of his books. And he talks about the Maroon. He talks about the warfare. Dallas, there's a man, R.C. Dallas. I remember what the R.C. stands for. But there's another British, actually Dallas was French, but anyway, he ended up in England and came to Jamaica and wrote a history of the Maroons and gave a lot of space to the Trelawney Town Maroons. The warfare, the type of warfare that they practice in Jamaica, their deportation to Nova Scotia, and also the further removal to Sierra Leone. So I know in those two primary sources, because Dallas was published in 1803, and Bryant book much earlier, right after the war, his book was published. So in those two primary sources, this information was given. Now, in terms of, say, British Imperial Army stuff, I don't know. That would be something that someone from the Army Museum could probably answer. We do have an Army Museum here on Citadel Hill, which is just a great place to go for information.
There are a couple of questions around education, and I want to put them together and leave them and pose them to you. Somebody asked, how do we get this history in the schools? Somebody has asked, are there short films, movies, and so on, depicting some of this history that you have given us in this lecture? So where are the points of education, both in the formal system and in the artistic world, for people to have access to?
Yeah, so in the history in the schools, I'm glad you talk about both formal and informal, because sometimes we really can't wait on the formal, you don't know when that's gonna come. I know Black Cultural Center has some relationship with the Department of African Canadian Education here in Halifax. John Grant's book is a great resource. Buy it off Amazon or wherever from the public library and read it. It's a wonderful book to read. Mavis Campbell's book is a little bit more, shall I use the word dense? It's for an older audience, but equally wonderful. There is the resource from which we drew the video with Nathan Simmons, blackhalifax.com, which I had a hand in creating. It's free, it's online, www.blackhalifax.com. There are learnings there about the Maroons, about the Black Loyalists, about the refugees. So in terms of, and then with Parks Canada, if you go online now, Parks Canada has the like a page and a half write-up on the Maroons, because the plaquing is happening next week. So really good information, very succinct. It's not a tome. You can read it in no time, but excellent, short, quick, very informative. So there's a lot of things online that came out of good, solid research. I mean, because you're gonna find also a lot of dubious things online. I see some things online which is pure misinformation, but at the same time, there's a lot, Parks Canada website, the blackhalifax.com, John and Grant's book, and at the end of my The last slide there, I had some resources that are both formal and informal. Now, the Department of African Canadian Education here in Halifax, you may contact them and ask what's been done. There are some schools in Nova Scotia that teach a course called African Canadian Studies. It's in the high school. It's like grade 10, 11, 12. And undoubtedly, the teachers will talk about some of these historical topics like the Maroons.
In the chat, there is a note from the Delmore Body Day Institute with a number that people can contact them if to continue the conversation about how to get the information in the schools. And I think we might have to wrap up in a few minutes. So I want to ask Olive if she would say something quickly about what will be happening at the Jamaican's cultural celebration with respect to the Maroons, just to say there's another opportunity to look at some more material. So you have 1 minute, Olive, and then anybody else?
Margie,
would,
let me just say, I just put it in the chat. There's a film and it's accessible by Roy Anderson. Roy Anderson is a compound Maroon from St. Elizabeth, but he's an actor, Hollywood actor. He did a film called Akwantu, Akwantu. It's a great film, and it's on the Kojo, a compound town Maroons, which is similar to the people we're talking about. And in Jamaica, every January 6th is Kojo's birthday. Kojo was the leader of the compound town Maroon. Now, Roy Anderson did a film, which is available. He also did a film called Queen Nanny, which stars Mama G, a Maroon leader from Jamaica. Mama G, Queen Nanny. So Roy has done 2 films. He did the Akwantu, which is on the Western Maroons, and he did the Queen Nanny, which is on the Eastern Maroons. And both of them are available. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. All right, Olive, remember to unmute, but if you want to say something, we will have about the special section of the exhibition and generally about the Jamaican. Please unmute, Olive.
Unmute. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. You may be aware of the exhibition that we had a collaboration with the Pier 21 Museum, 3 years ago during COVID, and we produced a video or movie called The Jamaican Nova Scotian Connection from the Maroon to the Present. And that is very, very filled with a lot of information, accurate information. And it will be in that education booth again this year. And additional to that, we have done some more research with your help and others to produce other mounted displays to accentuate and add information to the Maroon history. So we'll have a whole section of that, in addition to our emphasis on putting up a series of bio panels of people of Caribbean origin who came to Nova Scotia over the years, who have made a lot of contributions, and some of whom may have Maroon history, but they're originally from the Caribbean, and they have done great work in Nova Scotia in different professionals. And so that display will be there as well. And of course, some people will be there to answer questions, and hopefully we can carry the discussion on. But it'll be a fun day, and we're going to, of course, have a cultural show. And please come out and just have fun. And we pray for good weather.
Great. Thanks. So that's Sunday, the 28th of July.
28th, yes. From 1 to 9.
At Alderney Landing. 1 p.m. to
1 to
9
8:30, yeah.
And remember, August 1st, if you can't get there in person, we are moving from the Citadel Hill, the unveiling of the plaque, to Pier 21 Museum again with Professor Cooper, looking at enslavement in Canada. Yes, it did happen. and the conversation on emancipation afterwards at the Black Cultural Center. So please, all of these places that we are naming, look up their websites. There is more information that's online. And if we take nothing else, I would say, I quote Marcus Garvey from what Afua kept emphasizing. If we have no confidence in self, we are twice defeated in the race of life. So from Jamaica to Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone, there was this confidence that the Maroons kept with them. So I hope that we will learn from the mistakes and emulate the virtues and the strengths of all of the ancestors of African descent who converged in this place that we call Nova Scotia. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Russell, Olive, Rhonda, Afua, and everybody that has come on to be part of this. We hope that the conversation will continue and the work of building confidence and solidarity of people of African descent here in Nova Scotia and wherever you are joining us from. Have a wonderful evening and thank you.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.